Imagine, it's Medellín in the 1980s. You live in a neighborhood where one man is more powerful than the government. His name is Pablo Escobar. To the world, he's a narco-terrorist. But to you, his neighbor, he's El Patrón. He builds soccer fields, hands out cash to the poor, and funds housing projects. He's the local Robin Hood, beloved by many. But this loyalty comes at a price. The sound of car bombs becomes the city's soundtrack. Journalists, judges, and police officers who dare to challenge him disappear. The golden rule is Plata o Plomo, silver or lead. Take his bribe or take a bullet. Your neighborhood might be richer, but it's now a war zone. You aren't living next to a philanthropist. You're living in the center of a narco state, where your neighbor's generosity is funded by a river of blood and cocaine. Today, we'll count the true cost of being the cocaine king's neighbor, and show you why his charity was just the leash he used to own you. Living next to Pablo Escobar at the height of his power was to be immersed in a universe of unnerving dualities. To the outside world, the projected image was that of a benefactor, a father of the poor, in Medellín. And you most certainly would not survive it. Father of the poor in Medellín. Imagine waking up in a neighborhood where children play soccer on immaculate synthetic turf fields, built not by the government, but by the man in the house next door. Imagine seeing lines of grateful people at his door, receiving cash for medicine, food, or even to build their homes. This was Escobar's public persona, a seemingly devout family man who smiled for the cameras while handing out wads of cash. He financed housing projects, zoos, and was seen as a local hero, a paisa Robin Hood who stole from the rich gringos to give to the needy of his land. He was charismatic, approachable, and, for many, the only hope in a nation scarred by inequality. This calculated generosity was not just philanthropy. It was the construction of a human shield, a wall of loyalty that protected him from the authorities and his enemies. He didn't just give money, he offered dignity, and in return he received a complicit silence and a devotion that made him untouchable in his own territory. You as a neighbor would attend the barbecues, the extravagant parties at his legendary Hacienda Nápoles, a private paradise with exotic animals and unimaginable luxuries. You would see him as a loving father to his children, a present husband. He was on the surface the perfect neighbor, the one who solved the community's problems with an efficiency the state never showed. However, the daily routine, observed more closely, began to reveal cracks in this flawless facade. Normalcy was just a thin veneer over a dark and violent reality. The cars that entered and left his property at odd hours were not those of ordinary friends. They were convoys of armored vehicles, filled with men whose hard stares and visible weapons under their jackets moved with an urgency unbefitting a social call. The nights were often interrupted by the distant but unmistakable sound of helicopters and small aircraft taking off and landing on clandestine airstrips, an air traffic that appeared on no official record. There was something strange about his trash. Sometimes it was boxes and packaging for chemicals with strong odors, or fragments of clothing that seemed to have been hastily cut. The people who entered his house for business meetings did not always leave through the front door. Some simply vanished, and to ask about them was to break the golden rule of the neighborhood: see nothing, hear nothing, say nothing. The air was always thick with a palpable tension, the feeling that every smile and every neighborly gesture was part of a carefully orchestrated performance. Imagine a hypothetical encounter. Perhaps your car gets a flat tire in front of his house. Before you can even look for the jack, two of his security guards approach. They don't ask if you need help. They simply begin to change the tire with a mechanical and silent efficiency. Then Pablo himself appears. He smiles, places a hand on your shoulder, and says that neighbors help each other. He might even invite you for a coffee or offer a gift for your children. The kindness is undeniable, but the handshake is a little too firm, and his eyes behind the smile are cold and calculating. It's a gaze that doesn't just see you, but assesses you, measures you, and catalogs you as either an asset or a potential risk. In that moment, you understand the terrifying truth. His generosity is not a gift, it's a transaction. You are no longer a simple neighbor. You are a piece on his board. The help he offers is not an act of kindness, but an invisible chain that binds you to his empire. You feel a chill, the sudden realization that proximity to such power was not a blessing, but the beginning of a silent and terrifying survival. The carefully constructed illusion of the benevolent neighbor could only hold for so long. Eventually, the mask doesn't just slip, it shatters, and the brutal truth floods the very streets he paved with his blood money. The turning point often isn't a single private realization, but a public spectacle of violence so audacious it rips through the fabric of society. For Pablo Escobar, this was the assassination of Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, Colombia's Minister of Justice, in 1984. Lara was one of the few politicians who dared to publicly denounce Escobar, exposing his drug trafficking activities and challenging his seat in Congress. His murder was not a quiet disappearance in the dead of night. It was a brazen attack on a Bogotá street, executed by sicarios on a motorcycle. This act was a declaration of war against the state itself. It was Escobar's most emblematic crime to that point, a message sent in a hail of bullets. No one was beyond his reach. For you, the neighbor, this wasn't just a shocking headline. It was the moment the man who waved to you in the morning was publicly and irrevocably linked to the highest level of political assassination. The abstract fear that lingered in the air now had a name and a face. The same face that hosted neighborhood parties. The why behind the strange nightly convoys and the armed men became terrifyingly clear. They weren't just protecting a rich man. They were the instruments of a narco-terrorist state being born next door. This assassination was not an isolated outburst, but the public unveiling of his true modus operandi. Plata o Plomo, silver or lead. This simple, chilling phrase was the engine of his empire. It was a binary choice offered to anyone who stood in his way: accept his bribe and become an accomplice, or refuse and receive a bullet. This was his signature, a systematic approach to dismantling any opposition. He didn't just kill his enemies. He corrupted the very soul of the nation. Judges were bought, police forces were turned into private armies, and politicians became puppets. His method was a blend of psychological warfare and brute force. He would first try to charm and corrupt, using his immense wealth as a lure. If that failed, threats against the target's family would follow. A cruel but effective tool. The final step was ruthless, public violence, designed not only to eliminate the target but to terrorize anyone else who might consider defying him. He orchestrated the 1989 bombing of Avianca Flight 203 in an attempt to kill a presidential candidate, murdering 107 innocent people in the process. He was behind the 1989 DAS building bombing, a massive truck bomb that leveled the headquarters of Colombia's secret police, killing 70 and wounding hundreds. These weren't crimes hidden in the shadows. They were acts of war committed against civilians. This is where the horror becomes personal and immediate for you, his neighbor. While the news report spoke of another car bomb devastating a city block, you would connect it to the strange activity you witnessed the night before. The hushed, urgent loading of a truck in Pablo's compound. The acrid smell of chemicals you couldn't identify. The explosion that rocked the city and shattered windows miles away was the direct result of an order given by the man who had just complimented your garden. The news of a disappeared journalist, one who had been writing critically about the Medellín cartel, would coincide with the sight of your neighbor, Pablo Escobar, calmly washing the carpets of his car in the middle of the night. You would see the faces of grieving mothers on television and realize their children were the same age as the young men who served as Pablo's sicarios. Boys from your own community who had traded their futures for a motorcycle and a gun. The danger was no longer a distant concept. It was in the shared air you breathed. Every act of kindness from him would feel like a threat, a reminder of your proximity to the source of the nation's pain. You would start to fear the very ground you walked on, realizing that the soccer field where your children played was funded by the same money that paid for the bomb that orphaned other children across the city. The mask had fallen, and you were now living face to face not with a man, but with the monster he had become, trapped in the terrifying intimacy of his web. The terror of living next to Pablo Escobar extended far beyond the man himself. It was about the suffocating ecosystem of power and fear he meticulously cultivated. The danger wasn't just what he might do to you, but the chilling realization that the systems designed to protect you were now his personal instruments of control. This was most evident in his complete and utter neutralization of the law. The question that haunted every law-abiding citizen, why doesn't somebody stop him, had a simple, terrifying answer: because the people who were supposed to stop him were on his payroll. Escobar didn't just bribe individuals. He systematically corrupted entire institutions. Police officers in Medellín, from the beat cop on your corner to high-ranking commanders, were given the choice of Plata or Plomo. Many chose the silver, turning a blind eye to his operations, or, worse, becoming active participants, providing him with intelligence, clearing roadblocks for his shipments, and even eliminating his rivals. The police, once symbols of safety, became just another uniformed gang. Judges who received cases against him or his associates were sent briefcases full of cash, or, if they were stubbornly idealistic, photographs of their children leaving school. The message was clear: your integrity will cost your family their lives. Consequently, cases were dismissed. Evidence vanished from secure lockers, and arrest warrants were never signed. He had effectively dismantled the justice system from within, creating a parallel state where his word was the only law that mattered. For you, the neighbor, this meant there was no one to call. Reporting the suspicious truck you saw last night wouldn't bring a police investigation. It would bring a death sentence delivered by the very people you called for help. This institutional decay fostered a pervasive climate of fear that seeped into the very soul of the community. Life in the neighborhood became a masterclass in survival through silence. The unspoken rule of don't see, don't hear, don't speak was the first and most important lesson. Neighbors who once chatted over their fences now avoided eye contact. Their conversations reduced to meaningless pleasantries about the weather. A deep collective paranoia set in. Was the friendly shopkeeper an informant for Pablo? Was the new family that moved in down the street actually a watchdog for the cartel? Trust, the bedrock of any community, had completely eroded, replaced by a gnawing suspicion. The silence was a living entity, a heavy blanket of complicity that smothered all dissent. Everyone knew what was happening. They saw the young men recruited as sicarios. They heard the rumors of the desaparecidos, the disappeared, and they felt the tremors of the car bombs. But to acknowledge it, even in a whisper to a trusted friend, was to risk everything. Denouncing Escobar wouldn't make you a hero. It would make you a target, and your family along with you. The fear was so absolute that it inverted morality itself. Staying silent was no longer an act of cowardice, but an act of love, a desperate measure to protect your children. The streets he owned were quiet not because they were peaceful, but because they were terrified. This twisted reality was further complicated by the way the media and public perception portrayed him. To the international press and the elites in Bogotá, he was a narco-terrorist, a monster. But within Medellín, and even in parts of the national consciousness, he cultivated a powerful and conflicting image. The anti-hero, the Paisa Robin Hood. He was a man from humble beginnings who had defied the corrupt, entrenched oligarchy that had ruled Colombia for centuries. He built things, he gave back, he spoke the language of the common people. This narrative was intoxicating. It created a bizarre duality, where the man responsible for unprecedented violence was also seen as a champion of the poor. This public relations masterpiece made the situation even more dangerous and confusing for ordinary people like you. How do you reconcile the man who builds a hospital with the man who bombs a plane full of civilians? This conflict played out in your own mind. Part of you might have felt a flicker of gratitude for the safety from petty crime in your immediate vicinity, as no thief would dare operate under his watch, while another part of you was paralyzed by the knowledge of his larger atrocities. This conflicting public image was his greatest weapon. It divided the nation, blurred the lines between right and wrong, and made it nearly impossible to form a united front against him. You weren't just living next to a criminal. You were living at the epicenter of a moral civil war, where your neighbor was simultaneously portrayed as a saint and a demon. And choosing a side could be fatal. Every empire, no matter how powerful, eventually develops a crack in its foundation, and Pablo Escobar's was no exception. His fatal error was not a single miscalculation, but a cascade of them, born from an ego inflated by years of impunity. The beginning of the end was his self-negotiated surrender in 1991. To avoid extradition to the United States, he agreed to be imprisoned in Colombia, but only in a prison he designed and built himself, La Catedral. It was a luxurious fortress, more a private resort than a penitentiary, complete with a bar, a jacuzzi, a waterfall, and a soccer field. From here, he continued to run his global cocaine empire with impunity. This audacious mockery of justice was a step too far. It galvanized his enemies and forced the Colombian government's hand. The true crack, however, appeared when Escobar, from within his gilded cage, ordered the torture and murder of two of his own lieutenants, Fernando Galeano and Gerardo Moncada, over a financial dispute. This act of internal brutality shattered the myth of cartel loyalty. It sent a shockwave through his organization and, more importantly, created a new, formidable enemy, Los Pepes, perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar. This shadowy vigilante group, funded by the rival Cali cartel and composed of Escobar's former associates and victims' families, was as ruthless as he was. They began a bloody campaign, targeting his properties, finances, and, most brutally, his sicarios and family. While the government hunted him from above with the elite search block, Los Pepes dismantled his empire from within, matching his terror tactic for tactic. The man who had ruled by fear was now being systematically hunted by a monster of his own creation. The final act was a desperate, 16-month manhunt after he escaped La Catedral to avoid being transferred to a real prison. The contrast between the all-powerful Patrón and the hunted fugitive was stark. The man who once owned a city was now reduced to running between safe houses, growing paranoid and isolated. His vast network of informants had been decimated by Los Pepes and the search block. His immense wealth was useless, as accessing it would reveal his location. The investigation that finally cornered him was a relentless fusion of American surveillance technology and Colombian determination. The search block, led by Colonel Hugo Martinez, focused on the one vulnerability Escobar's ego would never let him sever: his family. They knew he couldn't resist contacting his son, Juan Pablo. On December 2, 1993, one day after his 44th birthday, Escobar made a series of phone calls to his family, who were sequestered in a Bogotá hotel. He stayed on the line too long. Using radio triangulation equipment, the search block pinpointed his location to a middle-class house in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellín. The ensuing scene was not a dramatic final stand of a kingpin, but the pathetic end of a cornered animal. When the police stormed the building, a barefoot, overweight Escobar scrambled onto an adjoining rooftop. He was no longer the dapper Don or the powerful El Patrón. He was just a man running for his life. A brief, chaotic exchange of gunfire followed, and he was struck down by bullets. The iconic image of smiling Colombian police officers posing over his bloody corpse was a jarring end to his reign. A visceral display that the untouchable man was, in fact, mortal. His death was not a quiet affair in a prison cell, but a violent conclusion on a terracotta rooftop. A fittingly brutal end for a man who had lived by the gun. In the immediate aftermath, Medellín erupted not in universal celebration, but in a strange mix of relief and grief. While the nation's elite and his countless victims rejoiced, thousands from the barrios he had supported flocked to his funeral, weeping for the loss of their twisted benefactor. This division was the deepest scar he left. The trial he never faced in a court of law was instead held in the court of public opinion, where the verdict remains contested to this day. His last moments were not of a powerful man in a dock, but of a desperate fugitive. A stark reminder that empires built on fear inevitably consume their creators. The man who held a nation hostage was ultimately brought down by a simple phone call to his son, a final, fatal act of human connection. But even with his death, did the fear he created truly disappear? The fall of one kingpin only created a power vacuum, leading to years of bloody turf wars, as other cartels and paramilitary groups fought to control the drug trade he had perfected, the institutions he had rotted from the inside with corruption, would take decades to rebuild, if they ever fully could. The legacy of Plata o Plomo became ingrained in the political and social landscape. For you, the neighbor, the immediate threat was gone. The strange convoy stopped, the helicopters fell silent. But the silence that remained was different. It was heavy with memory, haunted by the ghosts of what had happened on those very streets. The question that lingered in the quiet nights was a chilling one. What happens to the scars left on a society when it has been forced to live next to a monster? And what happens when it discovers that the monster was also, in some ways, one of its own? Living next to Pablo Escobar was a brutal lesson in the duality of power. The hand that gives is often the same one that takes everything away. His story teaches us that the most terrifying empires aren't just built on violence, but on a foundation of calculated generosity that turns neighbors into silent accomplices. The greatest danger wasn't the monster you could see, but the savior who made you question if he was a monster at all. Stories like this remind us that we must always look beyond the surface, for evil rarely announces itself. If you are fascinated by the complex shadows of history and want to continue dissecting the figures who blurred the line between man and monster, join our community of truth seekers and subscribe to the channel. And speaking of evil that hides in plain sight, Escobar's terror was loud, waged with car bombs and public assassinations. But what happens when the terror is silent? When it doesn't come from a cartel kingpin, but from the charming, handsome law student next door. In our next video, we explore a different kind of predator, one who used a perfect smile and a Volkswagen Beetle as his weapons. Click here to discover why you couldn't survive living next to